So there's a lot of negativity when it comes to young people and faith, but you've looked a lot at this as a researcher. What surprises you most about young people and spirituality today?
Well, look, I understand, first of all, just to say where those negative feelings come from. I mean, some of those traditional metrics like attendance and affiliation, I mean, those are down, and we're not going to dispute that. But I think for a long time, where those numbers used to be like indicators of the faith of young people overall, and they were really good indicators for a long time, they're not really they're not the whole story anymore. Increasingly, young people's faith expressions or religious expressions are happening sort of parallel to these institutional expressions. So it's possible for their faith lives to actually be stable or improving, in some ways, flourishing, while their institutional connections are diminishing. And we're not here to say at Springtide whether that's good or bad, but the reality is, like, we see, pretty high rates, like 3/4 of young people say they're religious or spiritual or both. Like half of young people say they pray on a regular basis. We see lots of desire from Gen Z to embark on these conversations and explorations of meaning and purpose and why am I here on this earth, et cetera. So the desire hasn't gone away. The exploration hasn't gone away.
Yeah, one of the interesting things, and I think this was a year or two ago, that came from one of your surveys was this idea. And of course, this is an idea that makes Christians very nervous and uncomfortable, is this idea that a lot of young people, over half, I think, of the young people who you surveyed were talking about, dabbling in tarot cards or different forms of spirituality. I think the interesting thing about that is that, yes, if you're coming from a Christian perspective, that's going to be concerning to you, understandably. But it is intriguing that there's an interest in the spiritual, right? It seems like there's an opening there for people. It's not as though everybody is saying, I'm an atheist. They're looking, it
That's
seems
right.
like, for something. Is that accurate?
That's exactly right. And we wrote this in RNS, Religion News Service, must have been last summer or something, that it's not like they're choosing tarot cards instead of Christianity. I mean, increasingly, this generation is exploring all these things. So what we wrote was essentially saying, like, this is tarot and Christianity, not tarot or. And it's that is, I'm not saying that makes people any more comfortable. Like, I totally
Right.
get the unease. But I think it speaks to your larger point, which is, the playing field here is the sort of metaphorical playing field is bigger and broader than I think a lot of people give it credit for. They see those numbers about declining attendance, and then they leap to a conclusion, understandably, that young people don't care about religion. But our data is suggesting that if we just look in a few other places, this fuller picture starts to emerge, and they actually really are interested in this conversation. Now, that automatic, like, because you're born in this country and it's a dominant Christian culture, et cetera, that you're going to be Christian, like, those days, I think those are like institutionally driven connections. I think that's largely gone. But that doesn't mean that young people don't care about faith, that they're not willing and, in fact, really desiring to have conversations with trusted adults around these issues.
Yeah, and this is important to talk about because people, for different reasons, they need to know and they want to know what is going on, demographically with all these issues. And yes, it's not going to make people in the Christian world any more comfortable that they're merging the two. But again, the assumption is that, we've lost people in this group, so they're just atheists now or agnostics. But that's a very small percentage of people across the board, right? It seems like there's just a lot more going on. There's a lot more competition when it comes to the spiritual realm, as you just said. That worldview, that sort of ingrained, this is what you're going to be because it's everybody around you, has dissipated now. But I wanted to ask you, because this stuck out to me, and it's something that I have seen in numerous surveys. It shows up in your research. Let's talk a little bit about comparing the young people who maybe pray a lot to those who don't when it comes to things like mental health. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Well, look, this is a trend that's been around for a long time. And we, at Springtide, all we do is focus on 13 to 25-year-olds. But places like Gallup and Pew, to use research at the 18, they study all adults, 18 and older. And then academics going back, across a number of different fields have confirmed this for a long time, that religion is good for you. Faith and spirituality are good for you. If you are a person who believes in some kind of higher power and has a connection to that higher power, you're generally flourishing more than your peers. And that's true for the young people that we studied too, that those who pray more tend to be flourishing more in all areas, including their mental health. And we are right now, and going back even before COVID started, we are in this epidemic of mental health among young people. This is the big focus for us at Springtide right now, is this, the intersection of faith and mental health. But the Surgeon General and the American Pediatric Association and other places have called this a problem since 2018 or so. So this has been going on for a while, and And the reality is like it's been happening, and young people would be both better off if they had, if more of them had a connection to something bigger than themselves. But also I think a lot of religious institutions and leaders would do well to take mental health into account so that like faith and belief could be appropriately part of somebody's overall like approach to health. So let me just give you one quick example. We do a lot of surveys, of course, but we do a lot of interviews too. And we listen to young people in some very structural ways, including a young person's advisory board that meets monthly with us. And what they told us at the beginning, what kicked off this whole study for us, is a young man who told me, I was dealing with depression and I went to my youth pastor and he told me, to pray about it and it would get better. And then when it didn't get better, he said, now my faith life sucks and my mental health sucks too.
Wow.
And I just was so touched by that moment that I was like, I think we can do better. And it's not like I don't really point the finger at that youth minister. I mean, what tools does he really have to work with there, right? So we set about trying to create some tools. And the shift is like, how can these things come alongside each other, right? Like faith is a component of flourishing and mental and all other forms of health, but it's a component. So how can we put these things into their right spots so that way everybody gets to play the role that suits them best?
Yeah, it's interesting, and maybe this is a hard question to answer, I don't know, but when it comes to things like prayer and connection, are there a lot of issues that you encounter like that have the same sort of relationship to mental health? And I guess what I mean by that is, it seems like this is, as you were saying, this is a consistent theme. We see it a lot across the board, regardless of what people think about faith, what they believe, whether they're atheists or Christians. The data seems to speak for itself. Are there a lot of other data points outside of that sort of affiliation or connection that have the same impact on people's mental health, let's say?
Well, so we focus on three big areas to create what we call like mental health friendly organizations. So if you're a church that wants to be like a mental health friendly church or a campus ministry, et cetera, and we talk about three buckets. One is connection or creating belonging. And we've also done a lot of research around that and how to do it. And the second is, do young people feel like they have the right tools to meet the expectations for them in a given space? So that quote that I just shared with you, for example, was a place where like, that was a mismatch, right, between tools and expectations. You were expected to flourish mentally and you were given, an incomplete set of tools. Prayer is an important part of that, but not the only part of that. And then the third part, as you mentioned, is connection to something bigger than yourself. So can we help young people to understand and see their story as part of a broader story? And we can bring those three things together: belonging, the alignment with tools and expectations, and connection to something bigger than yourself or purpose. Then we really start to, that's a pretty good recipe for creating resilient, young people who, there's going to be ups and downs in life, right? And there's going to be bouts with depression, and that's fine. And nobody wants those, but like, that's all pretty normal adolescent stuff. The question is like, what we're seeing right now is so many times these mental health issues become mental health crises. And it's because we're not embedding them in these systems and structures that give them the connections they need, give them the tools so they're not living with this cognitive dissonance of not being able to meet expectations. And are they seeing themselves as a part of a bigger story so they know that a setback isn't the end of everything? It's just a setback. So those are the three big things that we try to focus on.
And the irony of all of this is that, we're having this conversation. We live in this digital age. And I say this all the time. We're more connected than we've ever been in the history of mankind. And yet people are feeling more disconnected than they ever have. That's really interesting because maybe this connection that we've created digitally isn't quite filling the void, right? I don't know if
young people know it. I mean, when we talk to them, one of the things that became really clear, I don't know if they would have said this walking into the pandemic, but we surveyed them in the first weeks, a year later, and then 2 years later. And what we saw happen was this realization, both in our surveys and in our interviews with them, that the digital is just not enough. Like their online lives are really important to them, but what they started to see the real limitations of that and recognition that like, I can't just live here. But we shouldn't dismiss them. I mean, I had a young person tell me last year, they said, when adults dismiss my online life, they disqualify themselves from the conversation of my life. Like that, she said, not everything we do there is serious, but a lot of it is, and it's important to us. And so I think we have to keep it in its place, but to remember that like even young people know that it's not, they might not know where else to go, but they know that this isn't good enough.
Yeah, exactly. Now that's so interesting. And just to get back to prayer as we get ready to close out here, it's so interesting looking at satisfaction, looking again at mental health and whether or not you're flourishing and that connection to the people who are praying more and having that connection, faring better on those issues. When it comes to demographics, who are the most prayerful young people?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So Black young people really stand out. They're like at 49% compared to Hispanics at 37 and whites at 35%, Asians at 33%. Surprisingly for young people, we're starting to see some evening out between girls and boys, or women and men, young women and young men. Again, our data set is 13 to 25, where we used to think of women and girls as being a little bit more significantly higher there. We're starting to see those rates. I think it's largely as those rates sort of come down as opposed to men coming up. But Protestants are at 60%. I mean, it's a much bigger part of of the sort of theology and the culture there, to do voluntary sort of like individual prayer that lends itself to greater frequency when institutional attendance is not a part of the regular rhythm. So if you think about like a lot of Catholics growing up and thinking about prayer as a part of something you do at church at a service, so their rates are lower.
That's so interesting. Where can people go to find out more information about you and the work that you do?
Yeah, thanks. We're at springtideresearch.org, and there's a whole bunch of stuff there. You can find our mental health landing page with a lot of resources on that. And We Are Springtide on all of our social media platforms.
Well, listen, I so appreciate your time and looking forward to having you back more to talk on these important issues.
Thank you, Billy. Anytime.